The starship's celestial surveyor hummed softly, a near-silent symphony of thrusters and stabilizers keeping it aligned with the massive structure looming ahead. The Galactic Concord's central station, a marvel of engineering, hung in the void like a jeweled crown. Its spires and concentric rings sparkled with the light of distant stars, and its sheer size made Simon Hart feel like a speck of dust approaching a mountain. Ambassador, came the ship's AI voice, polite and steady. We are on final approach. The Concord delegation has been informed of your arrival. Simon leaned back in his seat and adjusted the lapel of his jacket. Thanks, Iris. Let's try not to crash this time, all right? The AI hesitated for a millisecond before responding. As always, Ambassador, your confidence is inspiring. With a grin, Simon stood, stretching before heading to the airlock. The Concord's summons had been abrupt, but that was par for the course in intergalactic diplomacy. Ever since humanity's entry into the Concord 30 years ago, Simon had been the go-to problem solver for situations where logic and protocol had failed, usually because humanity's peculiar ways were at the heart of the issue. As the airlock cycled open, the sight of Prefect Onkar greeted him. The Krillith envoy, a being whose crystalline body refracted light into a kaleidoscope of colors, inclined their angular form in a gesture of greeting. Ambassador Hart, Onkar intoned, their voice resonant like chimes in the wind. The Concord Council awaits. Your presence is required for a matter of great significance. Simon raised an eyebrow. Significance, huh? That sounds ominous. Should I be worried? Onkar's crystalline surface shimmered, a flicker of what Simon had learned to interpret as hesitation. Worry may be premature. Curiosity, however, is warranted. Well, you've got me curious already, Simon said, gesturing for Onkar to lead the way. The grand chamber of the Concord Council was a dizzying spectacle. Representatives from over 400 species filled the amphitheater like space, their diverse forms an endless array of shapes, colors, and biologies. Simon had learned early on to suppress his instinctive reactions to some of the more alien forms like the Gorval, who resembled 6-foot-tall jellyfish with glowing cores, or the Levicar, whose towering, insectoid frames made them look like nightmares out of Earth's fossil record. Taking his place in the center of the circular dais, Simon looked up at the first speaker. Zalor, a spherical being covered in shifting phosphorescent patterns, floated serenely above their podium. Ambassador Hart, Zalor began, their tone as calm as the ripples on a still pond. You are summoned today to address a phenomenon that defies understanding. Simon crossed his arms. Well, I've always enjoyed a good mystery. What's the issue? Without a word, Zalor gestured with a tendril-like appendage, and a hologram flickered to life above the dais. It showed a young woman in a rural setting, standing beside a hulking, wolf-like creature that bristled with muscle and menace. The predator's eyes glowed faintly, its teeth sharp enough to tear through steel. Yet when the woman tossed a ball into the distance, the beast bounded after it with exuberance, wagging its tail as it retrieved the object and dropped it at her feet. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of voices. Alien representatives chittered, growled, or pulsed with light, all expressing variations of disbelief. Zalor raised a tendril, and the uproar subsided. They turned their glowing gaze to Simon. Explain this. Simon tilted his head, studying the hologram. That's a dire lupus, he said, recognizing the species. Big, nasty predator from Rigel. Nasty unless. Oh, that's Max. Good boy. The chamber rippled with confusion. Good boy, Zalor repeated, their patterns swirling in perplexity. Ambassador Hart, that creature is an apex predator from a Class 9 death world. It is known for its aggression and inability to be subdued. Yet it fetches a ball like a docile companion animal. How did your species convince it? Simon chuckled. Convince? That's an interesting way to put it. Onkar's crystalline body glimmered with an uneasy hue. Ambassador, this is not an isolated incident. Your kind has domesticated creatures across many worlds, some of which defy logic. Canines, felines, avians, even species as formidable as the dire lupus. This behavior is incomprehensible. The Council demands an explanation. Simon smiled, his eyes twinkling with amusement. All right, but it's not as mysterious as you think. Let me explain. Simon's voice carried through the chamber as he began. Let's start with dogs. A long time ago, humans and wolves struck up an unspoken agreement. Wolves that were less aggressive realized that hanging around human camps meant easy meal scraps, leftovers. Over generations, humans and wolves became partners. The wolves that were friendlier and more cooperative got more food and protection. Over time, we bred traits that made them the lovable dogs you know today. Zauler's phosphorescent patterns shifted to a deep red. You altered their nature. Selective breeding, yes, Simon admitted, but it's not just that. It's about trust, mutual benefit, communication. Onkar tilted their crystalline head. Yet this does not explain the dire lupus ambassador. It is not a creature of your world. How does this method extend beyond your native species? Simon paused, choosing his words carefully. Humans are adaptable. We've learned to connect with creatures that aren't from Earth by understanding their behavior and finding common ground. Common ground, Zauler echoed, skepticism dripping from their tone. Simon gestured to the hologram. Take Max. He's a pack animal, right? In the wild, dire lupus form hierarchies. Humans have a knack for inserting themselves into those hierarchies. We show leadership, earn their trust, and establish bonds. Max sees his human companion as part of his pack, maybe even his alpha. The chamber erupted again, voices ranging from astonishment to outright disbelief. Zauler's patterns flashed furiously. Preposterous. A creature like that would see you as prey, not a leader. Not if you approach it the right way, Simon said with a shrug. It's all about respect and reward. Scratch behind their ears, toss them a treat, and they'll love you for life. Onkar stepped forward, their crystalline body shimmering. Ambassador, if you truly believe this. Skill is universal, then demonstrate it. Simon raised an eyebrow. Demonstrate. Bring this Max to the council, Onkar declared. We will observe this phenomenon firsthand. The next day, Simon stepped off the celestial surveyor with Max at his side. The dire lupus was an imposing sight 3 meters tall at the shoulder, its sleek black fur gleaming under the station's lights. Its glowing yellow eyes scanned the crowd as its claws clicked softly on the floor. The council chamber fell into a stunned silence as Max sat obediently beside Simon. The human scratched behind the beast's ears, and Max leaned into the touch with a low, contented rumble. Council member Simon began, gesturing toward the massive predator. This is Max. Say hello, buddy. Max barked a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the chamber and sent a few smaller representatives scurrying behind their podiums. Simon chuckled, pulling a treat from his pocket and tossing it to Max, who snapped it out of the air with precision. Onkar's crystalline form flickered. It obeys you. Of course, Simon said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. He knows I'm his friend. Valus, a serpentine representative with iridescent scales, slithered closer. This is unnatural, they hissed. That creature should see you as prey. Not if you show him you're not a threat, Simon said. Here, try this. He handed Valus a small treat. Hold it out and let him come to you. Valus hesitated but complied, trembling as Max sniffed the offering. The dire lupus gently plucked the treat from Valus's hand and licked it before sitting back down. The chamber erupted in astonished murmurs. Simon grinned. See? He's a sweetheart. The Concord chamber buzzed with activity after Max's demonstration. The sight of the dire lupus calmly interacting with a human and, shockingly, a serpentine Valus had the counselors reeling. Many species represented in the chamber were from high intelligence, low predation ecosystems, where the idea of willingly approaching an apex predator was unfathomable. Simon leaned casually against the central dais, watching the council deliberate in their own bewildering fashion. Some representatives communicated in soundless light patterns, others used vocalizations or pheromones. He caught snippets of arguments, many incredulous, others tinged with admiration. Finally, Zauler floated forward. Their phosphorescent glow stabilized to a shade of pale green, signaling they had regained composure. Ambassador Hart, your claim that humans can tame the untamable cannot rest solely on one example. Your dire lupus may be an anomaly, Simon smirked, crossing his arms. Max isn't an anomaly. He's just a good boy who knows he's part of the family. Onkar stepped forward, their crystalline form casting rainbows around the chamber. Ambassador, the Council has reached a decision. To validate your claim, you will demonstrate your species' ability to bond with a creature of our choosing. Simon's smirk faltered. A creature of your choosing. Yes, Onkar replied. One that represents the pinnacle of untamable ferocity, a Juraxian fireworm. The chamber erupted again, this time with reactions that ranged from disbelief to outright laughter. Several species clicked or chirped their amusement, while others whispered in alarm. Simon raised an eyebrow. Fireworm, huh? Sounds spicy. Zauler's tone was neutral, though the dimming of their luminescence hinted at skepticism. The Juraxian fireworm is a reptilian predator from the volcanic world Jurax 5. It is a solitary, territorial creature known for incinerating intruders. It has never been domesticated, trained, or subdued, not even by its native species, the Juraxians themselves. Simon took a moment to absorb this. He glanced at Max, who sat patiently, panting happily, completely unaware of the uproar he had caused. All right, Simon said finally, let's give it a shot. Onkar tilted their crystalline head, as though unsure they had heard correctly. You accept. Why not, Simon said with a shrug. But I'll need some fireproof gear and maybe a lot of treats. 2 days later, Simon stood in a specially reinforced enclosure aboard the Concord station. The room's walls shimmered with energy fields designed to withstand extreme temperatures and force. On the far side, secured in a containment module, was the fireworm. Even sedated, the creature was a nightmare made flesh. Its elongated body, easily 12 meters long, gleamed with scales that seemed to ripple like molten lava. Its 6 clawed legs twitched as it began to wake, and the ridges along its back glowed faintly, pulsing with internal heat. The Council observed from a safe distance, their expressions a mix of anticipation and skepticism. Max sat outside the enclosure, wagging his tail as if he were about to watch an interesting show. Simon adjusted his fireproof suit, which he'd insisted be as flexible as possible. All right, he said, mostly to himself. Time to meet the dragon. Onkar's voice came over the intercom. Ambassador, this exercise is likely to end with your untimely demise. You may withdraw at any moment. Simon gave a thumbs up without turning around. Noted. Let's do this. The containment field deactivated with a hiss, and the fireworm uncoiled, its head rising to a predatory height. Its eyes, glowing like twin furnaces, locked onto Simon. A low, guttural hiss filled the air, and the temperature in the enclosure spiked noticeably. Simon took a deep breath and stepped forward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Hey there, big guy, he said softly. You're a beauty, aren't you? The fireworm's head tilted slightly, its nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. Its tail lashed once, leaving scorch marks on the floor. Okay, Simon muttered. Good start. You haven't roasted me yet. The Council watched in tense silence as Simon continued his approach. He stopped a few meters away and crouched, making himself appear smaller, a trick he'd used before, when dealing with nervous or aggressive animals. See? I'm not here to hurt you, he said, keeping his voice calm. I just want to be friends. The fireworm growled low in its throat, and a small burst of flame escaped its nostrils. Simon reached into the pouch on his suit and pulled out a chunk of meat, holding it out. Hungry? Bet you are. The fireworm hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as it sniffed the air. Slowly it lowered its head, inching closer. The room grew even hotter as its breath washed over Simon, but he held his ground. Finally, the fireworm snapped up the meat, its jaws closing with a sound like a steel trap. Simon exhaled in relief, pulling out another piece. Good boy. See? I'm not so bad. The fireworm rumbled again, this time less threateningly. It took the second piece of meat from Simon's hand, its molten eyes watching him intently. From the observation deck, Zauler's bioluminescent patterns rippled with confusion. He approaches it as though it were a pet. This defies all reason. Onkar observed silently, their crystalline form dimming and brightening in thought. Back in the enclosure, Simon sat cross-legged, maintaining a non-threatening posture as the fire worm sniffed him curiously. "You're not so scary once you get to know me, are you?" he said with a grin. The worm let out a small, questioning chirp, a sound no one in the chamber had ever heard from the species. Simon reached out cautiously, his gloved hand brushing against its glowing scales. The worm didn't pull away. Instead, it made the sound again, lowering its massive head to rest near Simon. Simon glanced up at the observation deck and gave a triumphant wave. "I think we're making progress." The council chamber had fallen into stunned silence. Simon remained seated on the scorched floor of the enclosure, casually scratching the fire worm's glowing jawline. The creature, which moments ago had radiated an aura of lethal aggression, now emitted a soft rumbling, a sound that could only be described as contentment. Even Max, watching from the viewing deck, seemed intrigued, tilting his head as though judging this fiery newcomer. After what felt like an eternity, Sauler's voice broke the silence. "This cannot be real." Onkar, still staring at the scene below, adjusted their crystalline head. Ambassador Hart appears to have subdued the fire worm. Simon looked up, wiping sweat from his brow, as the worm exhaled another wave of warm air. "Subdued? Nah, I just made a friend. Isn't that right, big guy?" The worm let out a soft growl and nudged him with its massive snout. The murmurs from the council grew louder, ranging from awe to outright disbelief. Several representatives seemed to struggle with the concept itself. "Impossible," one of the insectoid Levicar clicked. "This violates every principle of predator behavior." "Behavior," Simon called out, raising his voice just enough to be heard. "You're looking at this the wrong way. Sure, the fireworm's an apex predator, but that doesn't mean it's immune to connection. It's all about trust and mutual benefit." The observation deck speakers buzzed as Valus, the serpentine counselor, joined the conversation. "Trust. You are a fragile mammal. That creature could incinerate you with a single breath. What possible mutual benefit could you offer?" Simon stood slowly, patting the worm's head as he walked a few cautious steps away to address the council. "It's simple. The fire worm wants safety, food, and companionship. I provide that. In return, it doesn't barbecue me. Mutual benefit." A burst of incredulous laughter erupted from one of the quadrupedal Colnaxian representatives, their iridescent frills shimmering. "Provide safety? From what, Ambassador? You are its inferior in every conceivable way." Simon raised a finger. "That's where you're wrong. See, humans don't rely on brute strength or physical dominance. We excel at cooperation, creativity, and most importantly, adaptation. We figured out how to survive by working with others, even those stronger than us. That's why Max listens to me, why wolves became dogs, and why this fireworm doesn't think I'm lunch." The council spent the next hour grilling Simon with questions. How did he know what gestures to use? What cues had he picked up? Why hadn't the fireworm simply ignored him? Simon explained as best he could. He talked about body language, vocal tones, and a knack for reading emotions, a skill humans had honed over millennia of living alongside animals. The trick, he concluded, is showing the creature that you're worth trusting, and a few snacks don't hurt. Still, not everyone was convinced. "This must be a trick," Sauler said, their glow dim with suspicion. "A fluke orchestrated to deceive the council." "Orchestrated," Simon echoed with a laugh. "You think I coordinated this with a creature that literally just woke up?" Onkar interjected, their tone calm but firm. "Perhaps a larger trial is required to satisfy the council." Simon's grin faltered. "A larger trial." The crystalline prefect gestured toward the enclosure. "If you claim that humans can establish bonds with any predator, then demonstrate this principle further. Perhaps 3 fireworms at once." The chamber erupted in chatter, several representatives objecting outright. Even Valus, who had been skeptical from the start, sounded alarmed. 3? That's excessive. He'll be vaporized before they recognize him as anything other than prey. Simon looked at Max, who wagged his tail enthusiastically, seemingly ready for another round of excitement. Then he glanced at the single fire worm, still lounging peacefully near him. 3. Ha, he wiped his brow again. Why not? But I'm going to need a lot more treats. The next day, Simon found himself back in the enclosure, now reinforced even further. 3 containment pods lined the far wall, each holding a fire worm of considerable size. All 3 beasts were restless, clawing at their confines as their glowing scales pulsed with barely restrained heat. Simon, dressed in a new fireproof suit, adjusted his earpiece. Any chance we reconsider this and call it a day? No? Okay, just checking. The containment pods deactivated simultaneously, releasing the fire worms into the enclosure. Each one snarled and hissed as they emerged, their tails lashing and their molten eyes locking onto Simon. Well, this is cozy, Simon muttered, holding his ground. The largest worm, nearly twice the size of the one he'd bonded with the day before, bellowed a challenge, sending a wave of heat that made Simon's suit's sensors chirp in protest. Max, watching from the observation deck, barked loudly, his tail wagging like this was the best game he'd ever seen. Simon crouched low, spreading his arms wide in a non-threatening gesture. All right, big guys, let's take this slow. The next 30 minutes were a masterclass in tension. Simon moved deliberately, his every gesture calculated to avoid provoking the worms. He tossed chunks of meat to them, always keeping a safe distance. The smaller of the 3 worms, still massive by any standard, was the first to show interest, cautiously approaching the human. It sniffed the air, then one of the treats, before snapping it up. That's it, Simon said softly. You're doing great. The other 2 worms were less cooperative. The largest continued to growl, pacing in a wide circle around Simon, while the third seemed entirely uninterested, staring instead at the observation deck as if contemplating whether the reinforced glass was edible. Gradually, the smaller worm moved closer, its posture less aggressive. Simon extended a hand, letting it sniff him before scratching just under its jawline. The worm made the same low rumbling sound the first one had, leaning into the touch. The audience above watched in stunned silence. Even Ankar's crystalline form seemed frozen in place, their light dimmed as though struggling to process the scene. The largest worm finally made its move, lunging forward with a roar. The crowd gasped, but Simon didn't flinch. Instead, he stood tall and barked a single, sharp command, stop. To everyone's astonishment, the worm froze mid-step, its molten eyes narrowing as it regarded Simon. The human stepped closer, meeting the creature's gaze without fear. You're better than that, he said firmly, holding out a treat. The worm hesitated, its growl fading to a low grumble. Then, with surprising delicacy, it took the offering from Simon's hand. By the end of the session, all 3 worms were lying near Simon, their postures relaxed. The largest had even allowed him to pat its snout, though it still regarded him with a wary gaze. The observation deck erupted in chaos. Representatives who had been skeptical were now in heated discussions, while others simply stared in awe. Simon wiped his brow and waved toward the council. Satisfied. Ankar's voice came through the intercom, tinged with something Simon hadn't heard before: admiration. Ambassador Hart, you continue to astonish us. Perhaps there is more to humanity than we have understood. Simon leaned against the enclosure wall, still catching his breath. The 3 fire worms sprawled in a semicircle around him, their fiery scales dimming to an almost serene glow. The largest, which had initially charged him, rested its massive head on its forelegs, rumbling softly in what Simon could only describe as a grudging acceptance of his presence. Max, still observing from the deck above, barked happily, tail wagging like a metronome. Simon chuckled. Good to see someone's enjoying themselves. The council chamber, by contrast, was a maelstrom of activity. Representatives argued, gestured, and flared their bioluminescent patterns in wild displays of disbelief. Vallis, the serpentine counselor, seemed locked in an intense debate with Exalor, whose phosphorescent body now radiated a chaotic swirl of yellow and red. Finally, Exalor raised a tendril, silencing the room. Ambassador Hart, the council acknowledges the extraordinary nature of what we have witnessed. However, questions remain unanswered. Simon adjusted his scorched gloves, straightened his posture, and raised an eyebrow. Oh? And here I thought we were all getting along so well. Onkar stepped forward, their crystalline form shimmering with shifting hues of lavender and silver. You have demonstrated an ability unparalleled in the known galaxy. No other species has tamed such ferocity with such apparent ease. This demands further exploration. Zoller turned their glowing gaze toward Simon. What makes your kind capable of this? It cannot simply be your physical form or verbal communication. Your fragility should render you unfit for such endeavors. Simon took a moment, considering his answer. It's not about strength or intimidation. It's about connection, understanding, and a willingness to try. Humans, we're different because we see potential where others see threats. Valis tilted their head skeptically. Potential? You saw potential in a creature that could incinerate you with a thought. Simon shrugged. Why not? Every predator has needs. Safety, food, companionship. They're not so different from us in that way. The council buzzed with quiet murmurs, but Valis pressed on. Even so, your methods remain enigmatic. You claim trust and patience, yet the speed at which these bonds form is unnatural. Explain. Simon hesitated. He had expected awe and skepticism, but the pointed focus unsettled him. I think it's just part of who we are. Humans evolved alongside predators. We didn't just fight them, we learned to live with them. Maybe that shaped how we think. Onkar's crystalline body brightened. You speak of adaptation. Does your kind possess a unique biological or cognitive trait that facilitates these connections? Simon thought about it. He hadn't considered the mechanics too deeply before. Humanity's knack for bonding with animals seemed as natural as breathing, but trying to explain it in galactic terms was tricky. It's not just biology, he said. It's culture, too. Humans value relationships. We put in the time, the effort, and maybe we're just stubborn enough to make it work. The chamber rippled with reactions, some approving, others skeptical. Saller's glow shifted to a muted green. If this is a cultural phenomenon, it is one that merits study. Perhaps your kind's success lies in its unique history of survival. Onkar stepped closer, their tone contemplative. Ambassador, the Concord has long sought harmony among its members, yet our approaches to conflict and coexistence often fall short. Your ability to forge bonds with creatures deemed untamable suggests there is wisdom in your ways. Will you share this knowledge with the council? Simon blinked. Share? Like a workshop? A ripple of confusion swept the chamber. Onkar tilted their crystalline head. A workshop. Simon grinned. Yeah, demonstrations, training sessions, maybe a few lectures. I can even bring Max. He's great with audiences. Max barked from the observation deck, as if on cue. Over the next several weeks, Simon found himself at the center of an unprecedented exchange. Representatives from dozens of species attended his workshops, observing as he worked with creatures from across the galaxy. Max became a star attraction, his playful demeanor disarming even the most skeptical counselors. Simon demonstrated techniques that seemed second nature to him, reading body language, rewarding positive behavior, establishing trust through consistent actions. He shared stories of Earth's history, of wolves becoming dogs, of horses carrying humans into battle, of falcons hunting side by side with falconers. Onkar, who attended every session, seemed particularly fascinated. Your kind's approach relies not on dominance, but on partnership, they remarked one day. This philosophy is alien to many of us. Simon chuckled. Well, dominance doesn't last. True loyalty comes from mutual respect. That's why Max stays by my side, not because he has to, but because he wants to. Onkar's crystalline body shimmered thoughtfully. Perhaps this is why your kind thrives where others struggle. You see beyond fear. The council's perception of humanity began to shift. What had once been viewed as recklessness was now seen as bold ingenuity. Species that had long avoided contact with their native predators began experimenting with Simon's methods, often with surprising success. One day, Exaler addressed the chamber. Their phosphorescent patterns glowed in harmonious shades of blue and gold, a rare display of admiration. Ambassador Hart, the Concord acknowledges the profound impact of your contributions. Your species has demonstrated a capacity for understanding and cooperation that enriches us all. Simon smiled. giving a slight bow. Thanks, Salar. That means a lot. Onkar stepped forward, their voice ringing with clarity. The Concord proposes a formal initiative to integrate human practices into galactic diplomacy and coexistence strategies. Will you lead this effort? Simon hesitated, caught off guard by the weight of the offer. Lead? I'm flattered, but I'm just one guy. Max barked, trotting up to Simon and nudging his leg. Simon laughed, scratching Max behind the ears. All right, maybe one guy and a great dog. Months later, Simon stood on the observation deck of the Celestial Surveyor, watching Max play tug-of-war with a young dire lupus pup. The fire wyrm he'd bonded with on the station now lounged peacefully in a reinforced habitat, serving as a living testament to humanity's strange, wonderful gift. Onkar joined him, their crystalline bodies shimmering in the starlight. Ambassador, your kind continues to defy expectation. Simon grinned. That's what we do best. Onkar regarded him with something that might have been a smile. Perhaps your species' true strength is not in taming predators, but in showing the galaxy what it means to build trust. Simon nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. It's not about convincing them, it's about believing in them. And maybe, just maybe, they'll believe in us too.